Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Excited to introduce you to our guest, Curtis C.Z. Zackery, author of the newly released book, Soul Rest, Reclaim Your Life, Return to the Sabbath. CZ is perhaps best known for his deep empathy and contagious passion for the gospel, which defies traditional barriers. Whether teaching, writing, or speaking, CZ provides a perspective on the gospel that's raw, accessible, and relevant. He has served in various ministry and leadership roles over the last 15 years, including church planting, pastoring, and speaking on rest, the kingdom, and the beauty of the gospel. He lives with his wife Monique and two sons, Noah and Micah, in Franklin, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. CZ, Curtis Zackery, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
It is truly an honor to be with you today. I can't wait to have a conversation with you.
Well, we're delighted. The subject, of course, is a Sabbath rest, and something that having grown up in traditional Judaism, coming to faith at 44, and still living a 24/6 life. It has been the foundational principle of the one command that God puts in the Ten Commandments that remains holy. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, and there are lots of reasons for it. But before we get into all of that, and we get into the concepts of spiritual fatigue and what Sabbath thinking is like and all these other very weighty, heavy matters, I want to take us on a journey back to when did they first start calling you CZ?
Yeah, so my name is Curtis Zackery. Ever since I was a kid, CZ has kind of just been a nickname that's stuck. You know, my dad's name was Curtis as well. So in and around the town, I grew up in a smaller town in New Jersey, and my dad was really adverse to the idea of me being junior. And so he did everything in his power to kind of steer people away from that. And so once CZ started popping up, it was kind of one of those things that kind of stuck. And so ever since I was a kid, it's kind of been there. And even when I go to new places, for some reason, it will just make its way back, you know. So there it is.
Well, there you go. That's who you are. Your journey to faith, I mean, you've devoted the last 15 years of your life to serving in one form of ministry capacity or another. And that journey had to begin somewhere. Where did that journey begin for you? How did you come to faith? And who were the influencers that you began to look at as mentors and models for who you wanted to architect your life and pattern after?
Yeah, so back in the beginning of that journey, growing up in New Jersey, I was a kid who, like many other kids, had an issue with trying to understand and discover my identity, what that really meant and represented in my own life. And so just through various life's conversations and just the motion of the momentum of life, just trying different ways to fit into different groups of people and never really finding a place of resonance or belonging, you know, in the midst of that journey. And when I was a young child at about 8 years old, my mom had an experience of a connection with Jesus, and it changed her life, and it reformed everything about who she was. And so at that point, we started attending church. My parents weren't married, so I went back and forth between my mom and my dad. And in my experiences with my mom on the weekends, we'd go to church, and I really began to find a sense of belonging in the church community. It was one of those things where just the nice nature of these people and the welcoming and accommodating nature of what church represents kind of gave me a place to belong and to fit without really trying too hard. And so that by itself became very appealing to me. But as life began to progress and I grew up and got into middle and high school, I still was a part of church and was really a part of the rhythm of all the things that were represented by church. But I could honestly say that my heart wasn't truly connected to the principles and the ideas around who Jesus was and what that meant. I would have said, if asked, I was a Christian. I thought, going to heaven was a better option than the latter or the opposite, and I would have said that the good way that people were living around the principles of the Bible probably represented a better way to live. But as far as my heart compulsion, Jesus himself was not truly beautiful to me. And so it wasn't until I got to later years in high school, I played football, that really was truly my identity, my ability to do that well. I hurt myself my senior year. I hurt my knee. It was kind of the classic story. It derailed my plans to play in college. And that exposed to me just the sheer nature of all of my eggs being in that basket, so to speak. And at that time, I began to realize I didn't have a clear or a sustainable pathway toward the future around what substance really looked like from my life. And so began to ask different questions. What am I going to do in the future? What does this mean for me? And there was almost this sense of apathy that started to creep into my life. But along the way, at the church that we were attending, there was a table that was set up for a Christian university that really I filled out the application mainly because there was no application fee. And I just thought, why not? We'll just throw my hat in the ring and just see what happens with it. And after I hurt myself playing football, all the opportunities to play football in college and the scholarships were taken away. I had now this empty landscape around what college looked like. And somebody from that university called me up and said, hey, we'd love for you to still come if you're interested. And the idea of leaving New Jersey and going to Virginia was very appealing to me. So I didn't really get it, didn't understand what it all represented. But I just decided, this would be an adventure. It's a new thing to do. It gets me away from home. And when I got there, I quickly realized that there was a distinction about this place being a Christian university. It wasn't just simply Christian in name. It wasn't just Christian in its title. It really represented a collection of people who were interested in following the way of Jesus for real. And that was something that was new to me, that there was more than just words talking about Jesus, but there was a life that was truly given over to the way of Jesus. And in that, I saw just how that was represented in the midst of people who would say with their mouths that they believe these ideas of Jesus, but live differently with their lives. And so I think for the first time in my life, I really understood that there was this hypocrisy that was present in my own life. I was saying a lot of things about Jesus and would have said that I was aligned with the way of Jesus, but ultimately my life said something different. So I just began to read the Bible for myself in this Christian university setting, and it wasn't as a result of a sermon or a talk. It was really just reading the Bible and believing that there was a Jesus in this Bible that I wanted to know and I wanted to live like. So I said, God, if you're real, I want you to change my life and my heart. And I believe that he did that in that time.
Do you think that hunger or that unidentified hunger could relate to the fact that you had this, I don't want to say it was dysfunctional without knowing the circumstances, sure, but back and forth between mom and dad not being married, your identity comes into question as to who am I if I am not enough to glue the mom and dad together, then what is it going to take, and how do I define what an active, engaged father figure is and what an active, engaged mother figure is in the standpoint of defining myself as what do I desire, what do I foresee, what's my vision for a family. And so it's interesting that so often I hear these stories and it winds up being, well, that's when I joined the family of Christ and I had in the supernatural what I never had in the natural, and that was a complete identity reflective of the identity of the Father, reflected in the identity of the Son, and now I had something in which I could put kind of a focal lens on that would help me have clarity as to who I am, not just by I'm the football player or I'm the this or I'm the that. Now I'm a part of this larger body.
Yeah, I think the thing that's probably relatable to all of us, regardless of situation, I think my familial connection represented what it did, and I believe that my parents did the best they could with what they had, and I think the thing that's relatable to everyone is that we all inherently desire to belong. We all desire to be a part of a family, and that's innately birthed inside of our hearts. Every single one of us, from creation, I believe, from our inception, were longing and meant to be a part of a family. And I think the realities of what it says in Romans 8, that all of creation is groaning and longing to be restored back to the way that God had intended, represents the broken nature of what this world truly is and represents. And so in this world, I think all of us in some way find ourselves longing and wanting for what God intended initially for us to experience in Him. And so, yeah, I think in my story, what that represented is seeing that vivid reality of the broken nature of this world represented through family, through relationships. I think for other people, it's represented in different ways, but I think ultimately we land in the same place because we have this innate longing, this innate reality. In Ecclesiastes 3, says that God set eternity in the hearts of men. There's this innate awareness of who God is and what He means to and for us. And I think every one of us are born with that awareness. And so I think in my life, yeah, there's definitely a part of family that led me to the pathway of seeking fulfillment through God. But I think the resonance is it doesn't take for us to have a crazy story or some sort of, interesting situation in that way. I think we're all longing for those things, and God uses what He uses to draw us to Himself.
CJ, you graduated from that college. What did you do after college as far as answering the call or hearing a call, or did the phone even ring?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was at university, I think one of the things that was so important to me was to now understand what does it mean to live a life in light of knowing this Jesus. I think that became my most important question in my life. And what's interesting is most of my life spending time around the things of God and, just attending church, Bible studies, things like that. Very seldom was I asking that question or was I asked that question. It was really more about, when you die, where do you stand with God? And I think that that's a very important question, of course. But I think what I began learning was when I was studying the scriptures, I was seeing how often the premise of knowing Jesus and following Jesus mattered for life on earth. So my question was, what does it look like for me to now live my life as a result of following Jesus? So during the summers when I was in college, I started working at this Christian sports camp for urban youth. And these kids would come from all around the country, and we'd spend 8 days with them, and we'd talk about Jesus. And, I was a counselor in a cabin. I'd do things in the front, just kind of representing just the kingdom and encouraging people. And I began to quickly realize in that engagement, this is the type of thing that I want to do for the rest of my life, just serving other people and pointing to the hope of Jesus. Now, that didn't automatically equate for me to a call to ministry, but I did know for sure in my own language that I wanted to do for the rest of my life what this idea represented, serving other people, talking about Jesus, pointing to hope. And it was a thing that as you were alluding to earlier, it was a deficiency in some of the areas of my life that I wanted to represent for other people. And so in that way, I began to see, all right, maybe this is something that you're doing in me. So every summer while I was at college, I'd go back and work at that camp, and I was growing in my faith, growing in discipleship, began to be around other people who were peers who in their own right were reading and studying and going deeper in their growth and understanding of Jesus. And it was encouraging me. I was hearing different conversations about who Jesus was, and it made it way more relatable. And this idea of growth and discipleship became way more important to me. And in that way, I began to seek out other people, older men and women who could pour into my life and deposit ideas about who Jesus was in their own lives, their own experiences. And it began to grow my awareness of what that could mean and represent. So when I finished my time at university, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, at the behest of a couple who I'd met through that camp. And they just thought, they saw some things in me that I didn't see in myself. And they said, why don't you come to Nashville and let's just ask the Lord together what he might be saying about ministry in your life. They knew that I had a desire for that. I knew I had a desire for that. I just didn't know what it looked like. And so taking that step of faith and that couple investing in me really gave me the pathway to say, yeah, this is what I want to do. And so that's how I ended up in Nashville.
Okay, and in what capacity did you take the path of youth pastor or get involved in youth?
Yeah, so when I first came to Nashville, my heart was completely connected to serving teenagers. I knew that that was where I felt some of the biggest areas of deficiency in my own life. And I thought, if I can just represent the way of Jesus to this group of people in a way that's relatable and that they can connect to, I think it can be meaningful. And again, I didn't really have an idea around working for a church or even using words like vocational ministry. I didn't really understand or know those at the time. But yeah, I began to use music and speaking as a way to just connect with different groups of people. I'd go to neighborhoods which were under-resourced or didn't really have a large population of churches, and there were different relationships around the country. I'd partner with friends who were working in different areas that I'd met from that camp that were looking to connect with different kids in their neighborhood, and I just started traveling around and just sharing the message of Jesus, what he'd done in my life, what I felt like he could do in theirs. And it kind of turned into this thing where on its own began to build a momentum toward a call in ministry and serving those kids. And the church that I was a part of in Nashville invited me to be a part of the community there with their students. And they said, hey, would you be interested in maybe leading our group of kids here? And that really kind of got my foot into the pathway of vocational ministry and working with the church as well as outside of the realm of the church.
So in all of this, you're feeling pretty fulfilled?
Yeah, so I think in all of that, I began to recognize that the things that God had kind of built me and made me to do were a point of identification for me. So again, back to that idea of identity. So there's beautiful work that comes as a result of this. What I was saying and preaching and believing was actually true in my heart. But one of the things that I did begin to realize as I was progressing in this growth path in ministry was my identity was definitely connected to my ability to do the things that I was doing. So my ability to talk in front of people or to be able to study the word and to lead a Bible study or to meet with people over coffee. Those things were really important and I knew they were good, but so much of who I was tethered to those things. So my identity sadly began to be associated with my ministry rather than the God who I was seeking to serve through ministry.
In realizing that, coming to grips with that, coming to that awareness that this is typical of most men, that we are defined by our work. When people ask you, tell me about yourself, you tell them what you do.
Right.
If you ask a wife or a woman, tell me about yourself, they'll tell you who they are.
That's right.
Not what they do. And so we are often defined by what we do, even in ministry, even in serving the Lord. And we look at the scriptures and we see that faith without works is death. Therefore, I'm working for the Lord. I'm doing the Lord's work. I'm about my Father's business. We can go on and on with the references to why this is such important. Stewardship, the work that Noah had to do, and the 7 others for 150 days, really over a year that they were on board the ark. They had to feed the animals. They had to take care of protecting and nurturing what God had given them stewardship over. So at some point, you come to the realization that, wow, my life is organized in such a way that it's filled with ministry duties. And yes, I'm wholly yielded unto the Lord, but I'm starting to feel like my cup is pouring out, and as much as I'm pouring out is not as much as being poured in. And
Yeah.
I'm starting to feel like the weight of the cup is lighter, and I'm beginning to realize that the cup is emptying out at a faster rate than is being filled, and I'm starting to feel a little weary and a little fatigued, and some of the joy and some of the desire to jump up at what I used to jump up at is now, all right, yeah, I did say I'd do that, okay, I'll go. How does that come upon us? And it's deceptively, it's almost as if a drift takes place. It's not a change, it's a drift.
Yeah, and I think what you referred to a little bit earlier is really important. The inherent realities connected to what we teach about working inside of usually our church communities. The work that we do, even whether we do it inadvertently or intentionally, becomes our point of identification, even from our leadership in churches. So, who we are and whose we are is less the conversation as much as what we do and what that represents. And so for me, the pathway into that point of awareness really came when we moved from Nashville, my wife and I, to join a small church plant in an under-resourced community in the Bay Area, just outside of San Francisco. And it was during that time where I was experiencing rich relationship, real interaction, I mean, substantive community work and just beautiful connection points. But inside of that, what I began to recognize was my point of identity and my ability to do what I did in ministry wasn't enough to sustain some of these real life, really hard situations that we were engaging in. You know, homeless friends who were looking for a place to live, people who were walking through addiction and recovery situations, people who were transitioning out of prison, and we were doing life with these folks. We lived right next door to the church, and it wasn't unheard of to get a knock at 3 a.m. and just say, hey, we need help. And so what I began to recognize was exactly what you said. There was a meaningfulness to the work that I was doing, but my drive and desire to engage it just simply didn't come naturally the way that it did when I first engaged it. I start to feel like there is a fatigue, and that fatigue is untouched by naps. It's untouched by days off. That fatigue is untouched by even a vacation. There's something in me that feels just continually tired, and it becomes concerning. And that concern can lead you to do one of two things. Either put your head down and keep pushing forward, or to stop in that point of awareness and say, okay, something is wrong. Let me pay attention to this and figure out what the reality is.
You know, Jesus said, come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Yeah.
The proper name for rest is Noah. His name means rest.
And that's my son's name.
Well, there you go. But he was referring to a rest which is related to the Sabbath, Shabbat. And before we go to break, I'm going to leave the audience with this picture of the cross. And I want you to number along the cross 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And at the top, of course, would be number 1, there shall be no other gods before me. Makes sense that on the cross that would be the top. We come down to 2, 3, and 4 happens to fall, and if you look at the cross, it is not, the cross piece is not halfway down. It's actually positioned in a very unique position. You could be crucified 1 foot off the ground. Your weight's the same to cause the suffocation as you are at a higher point. But the cross became meaningful in more than one way. And so we come to the Fourth Commandment, which is honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And the first 4 commandments, as we look at it, establish our relationship with God. No other gods before me. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Create for yourself a graven image, and honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Those 4 are vertical relationship with God. Then we have this horizontal piece, which is the connection to what's below the cross, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which all have to do with our relationship with other people. But yet if we look at how the cross is set up, and the cross piece being the Sabbath, without us having the Sabbath, we have no relationship with God. And to be honest with you, if we don't take a Sabbath, we're starting to not be able to stand our fellow man. Our relationship horizontally is absolutely out of balance. And Jesus made it very clear, if you bring your gift to the altar and thereby realize your brother has something against you, go be reconciled to your brother. This was important to him, to love your neighbor as yourself. Paul says we're in this ministry of reconciliation. We can't do that without this very, very important part of it. But there's even so much more in this. But I want to give our audience this picture so that when they hear you speak about soul rest, as to where the power for the soul comes from, where the power for rest comes from, and how you can reclaim your life by returning to the Sabbath. We're talking with CZ Zackery, Curtis Zackery, author of Soul Rest, Reclaim Your Life, Return to Sabbath. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to bring you the rest of this incredible story. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, We have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Curtis Zackery, author of Soul Rest, Reclaim Your Life, Return to Sabbath. Curtis, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very interested to find out when the light went off for you. Here you are busy, and I think the word busy, it's one of those, I think it's called an onomatopoeia. It sounds, it gives a sound of, and so the buzz of bees, biz, e. We know that bees are feverishly working all the time to build the net, the hive, fill it with nectar, feed the queen. They're always at work, working in a colony, and we tend to get busy. And with busyness, just like in football, after you had a hard practice, a hard scrimmage, and then a game, you had some weariness, some battle fatigue, if you will.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be that way in God's economy. If you're flowing in the river of God's blessing and flowing in the river of God's provision, like Noah, you should be safely pitched into the ark, and the ups and downs shouldn't bother you, but yet we are not wired that way. So we can find ourselves in a season of a certain amount of heaviness, and we begin to question, what were the prime indicators to you? How did all this begin? And this is, once again, this is a backward look at the events leading up to the realization as to where you are today and what's behind the message of soul rest.
Yeah, so as I've explained, the working and identity connected to ministry, being interwoven and intertwined, all with the aspiration to honor God with all of that, just became this interconnected, interwoven thing that existed. And that in and of itself became the motivator, the driving point to be able to continue to work, to provide valuation to what I do, to my representation of God on earth. All of those things were together. And I think when I moved to the Bay Area, began to work in really intensive situations, I began to realize that on my own, I would not be able to sustain this type of work. The other thing that happened during that time, my wife and I experienced loss through miscarriage, and we had two within about an 8-month period. And the second time was pretty physically taxing on my bride. It was really emotionally taxing on both of us. We were a bit further into our carrying of the baby, and just kind of had a bit of a traumatic experience in that whole process. And that became another point of connection to say, wow, experiencing loss like this in the midst of what we're doing in ministry, working for God, was really this point of questioning that both of us began to engage to say, what does this all mean and represent? And I think the third piece of that was we were working alongside some beautiful people that we loved and were laboring with. They were incredible. But as we were experiencing this loss and I was starting to experience this fatigue, what we had represented in the time when we lived in Tennessee was this element of community and connectedness of people who were older than us that were pouring into us, again, peers and friends we were running with, and also younger people that we were spending time with. And I think it was the three of those things converging at one space to show me in God's grace that this simply wasn't sustainable. Life couldn't continue this way. So I remember going to my wife and I said, something needs to change. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I can't keep powering my way through this, just willing my way through working for God in this way. I know what we're doing is meaningful, but I don't know how to keep it going. So we, after about a 3-month period, we came to that resolution. We shared with the friends there. And after about 3 months, we decided to pack up all of our stuff and we moved to Sacramento, about an hour and a half away from where we were, and lived with my wife's family. And I just remember on the very first day after we moved in and had all of our stuff there, I was out on the front porch and it was a beautiful California day. The sun was shining, birds singing, I mean, picturesque, you know? And I felt like God said directly to my heart in that time, I'll never forget it. I felt like God said, if I take away your platform and all the things that you're known for, all of the things that you're doing for me, if I take away your ability to do those things, would you love and worship me with the same passion? And I knew quickly and troublingly that my answer was no. It was not true. It wasn't the question, do I love God? No, I did love God. But what he was asking me was, do you have the same passion, the same fervor? Do you have the same desire? Am I enough for you without the things that you get to do for me? And sadly, the answer was no. So that was really the beginning of that.
Thank you for your transparency, because I think that most people would flat out lie. They would say, no, I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord. I love you, but you're going to deny me 3 times. No, Lord, that's never going to happen. I would never do that. Nope. Before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Sure. No. Same kind of crossroads as Peter found himself, you found yourself, but you confessed.
Yeah.
So
and God's gracious to us. I think that that's the beauty. I think every one of us have these moments of reckoning. And I think that the question will be, do we desire to lean in and ask God to remedy the thing that is dry or broken? Right. Or do we desire to continue to resist and withhold from that ability?
So what led you to the realization that the Fourth Commandment had a role in the Christian life, in the life of everyone that wanted a relationship with God? Because we would consider this to be in the Leviticus 23 realm, one of God's appointed times. And so if you had a dentist appointment, you'd keep it. If you had a doctor's appointment, you'd keep it. If you had an appointment with God, would you keep it? And he established the Sabbath as an appointment with him to not do our regular work, to find fellowship, to find rest in him, whether it's organized or disorganized. I can tell you that in Tel Aviv, Shabbat is spent on the beach. In Jerusalem, it's spent in the synagogue. It's still both celebrating the Sabbath because the businesses are closed, but nevertheless, the observance of it is personal, but nevertheless, it's still done.
Yeah.
So how did you come to this understanding, and how did it impact you?
Yeah, so interwoven with all the things that I've shared and represented about what ministry and life look like, all of that was very rooted and connected to a Western way of thinking about the idea of following Jesus. Here in America, what it means to live vocationally in ministry. Like I said earlier, those words weren't really a part of my story for a long time. But what I began to see was, in my desire to serve Jesus, I had such a rooted understanding of what that looked like, represented by what I had learned and experienced in American church, the Western church. And even our gathering together on Sundays, I know is rooted in the thought of observing the Sabbath. But what I think you and I both know and understand is, though that would be true, Sunday is probably one of the least restful days in the context of what it means to vocationally serve in ministry. So back to that point of identification for me to say, all right, something needs to change. I really felt very clearly, again, as a message from God, that he was saying to me that I needed rest for my soul. And I didn't really quite know what that looked like. So I just honestly, frankly, started at the beginning of the scripture and began to look at what rest looked like in the narrative of the Bible. And obviously, it doesn't take very long to bump into the idea of rest. In the creation account, God on the seventh day rests, and he sits down as a result of his work, his finished work, and he is representing the thought and the idea to the humanity who he would create, that this is what they are to do. And in Exodus 31, something was really fascinating to me. So I started to examine this idea of rest. Obviously, this is a picture of rest that comes from the God of the universe. We know, because we keep reading the Bible, that he's not physically tired. So why would the God of the universe feel it important to rest? Well, in Exodus 31, it's really fascinating because it says that he rests as a representation to the humanity he created. But it also says that he rested and was refreshed. Now, that was a new idea to me. Like, as I was exploring this idea of rest, I'm thinking the God of the universe is refreshed in his resting as a representation to humanity. Well, I start to see, as you look at all these threads that are interwoven, this God who created everything looks back at everything that he made, everything that he created by his hand, and he says that it's good. He is satisfied with his work. So even in Exodus 28, when he gives that command, the fourth commandment, honor the Sabbath, he says, for 6 days you'll work, and on the seventh day you will rest. But he says something that I think we say often, but don't really take into account the reality of. He says to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, keeping the Sabbath holy, again, is not something that we by default really lean into. We actually think that keeping the Sabbath holy is almost like more inactivity. The less that we do, the more still we can be, the more holy we're keeping the Sabbath. But to keep it holy is this active engagement of the reality of God's finished work, acknowledging the idea that what he made by his hand is enough. Our significance, our value doesn't come from the other 6 days of our working. It comes from the satisfaction that God has made what he needed to make. Now, how that really springboarded for me was seeing the parallel really beautifully connected to how you even explain the cross as a vital element connected to the Sabbath. So you go Old Testament, creation account, picture of the Sabbath, Exodus, Leviticus, these pictures of the Sabbath. Well, fast forward to the New Testament, you have Jesus bloody and beaten on the cross. He is heaving, and he is there at the end of his life as a result of living on earth. Philippians 2, fully taking on humanity, taking on the sin of the world. They're about to take his last breath. But before he does, he breathes in and he says the words that we all know so well. It is finished, how we translate it in English. And what's so fascinating about that is if you ask the question, well, what is finished? Well, the work is finished. Now the work is done. And you have this beautiful parallel between God in the creation account and God on the cross saying that the work is done. He looks back at all the work is done and he says, I am satisfied. Tetelestai. It is finished, right? And this is a word that is representing the thought that we in our humanity know that it is his work that brings significance, not our work. So in the wake of his finished work, we find rest. So this starts to change my life because now I'm realizing his intention for our understanding of Sabbath wasn't just simply a rule for us to follow, but it was a pathway to commune with him. It was his intention for humanity from the very beginning to find fulfillment and wholeness in him. So that's where I started the journey, and that started to take on connotations and implications in every area of who I was.
When you dedicate a day to the Lord, and for the purpose of one, honoring the Sabbath, two, keeping it holy by, and that does not mean you can't go do things, you can't be You can't watch a movie, you can't this, you can't that, you can't that. That was the heaviness and the weight of the law and the burden of Sabbath observance, which we refer to as Shomer Shabbat, meaning that you didn't light a fire, you didn't extinguish a fire, you didn't live further than a Sabbath day walk from the synagogue.
Right.
I remember I was a member of an Orthodox synagogue in Atlanta, and in order to keep up the appearance that I was still Shomer Shabbat, I couldn't afford a home near the synagogue because that was the wealthiest area of town. So in order to be a part of that synagogue, I couldn't be seen driving into the parking lot. The parking lot was empty on the Sabbath. So I found friends who lived a block and a half away, and I said, can I drive to your place and walk with you so that I could appear to be
Yes.
Sabbath observant? And they said, sure. And I saw the hypocrisy of it, but my heart was right because I didn't want to miss the Shabbat service, but I just couldn't afford to live within a Sabbath day walk of the synagogue. And they didn't really question me about it. They apparently this was something that a lot of people did, just
Sure.
wasn't really spoken about.
Sure. Yeah.
So how did it impact your life? What did you do
Yeah.
intentionally, and how did that roll over to your relationship with your wife, with your children, but more especially your relationship with God, and how did you get refreshed as he did?
And you know what's so amazing? Just piggybacking off of your story, I think your story is the exact story that's represented in Matthew 11. You know, the verse you quoted earlier. You know, you have Jesus who is standing in the midst of a group of people who are seeking to figure out how to follow this path by which one walks, the way to be godly. You have all these ceremonial and civil laws that have been imposed by the Pharisees and the rabbis of the time to preserve these rules like the Sabbath. And everyone is kind of looking the other way because we all want to be perceived as this righteous person, and we all want to be perceived as doing the right thing. The people who are seeking to fulfill all of these mandates in these ceremonial civil laws, they're unable to do it. It's exhausting. So even what you just represented in your story, just hearing the story, it's exhausting. Let me figure out a way to go find a place, to go park a place so I can go do a thing, so I can. And Jesus, who is saying these words to these people, knows that they are exhausted in their pursuit to try to live this righteous life. So when he says the words, "Come to me, all who are weary," it's not just an encouraging verse that we can share with people if they're feeling a little tired. No, he was saying that there is a way of following the path by which one walks that is not represented by our righteousness and our own work. Jesus is saying, I can give you another way. And when he says, take my yoke, take my teaching, and learn from me, I'm gentle. What I'm saying to you is different than what these people are saying to you. They're telling you need to work to earn your rest. I'm telling you, I will give you rest, and I will do it freely. As a matter of fact, I will take on all of the work. The burden will be on me. Now, that is a game changer. So if I can begin to look at my life and say, wait a minute, if Jesus really meant that, then what does he mean by that now in my own life? And so I started to realize that the first place where I found refreshment and rest was to realize that my work did not produce my significance, my value, or my identity. It was through the finished work of Jesus that I found my belonging, who I am. So you even referenced the verse earlier that was so important to me in this wrestle, this tension, that faith without works is dead. I think that verse is absolutely true. I think 1,000% about that verse is important for us to know. I think the idea about it is broken in our humanity and especially in our American lenses. We think unless we work, we don't have faith. But truly what Jesus is saying through the gospel is because of our faith, we can't help but to work. Changes everything. Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says it's by grace we've been saved through faith, not from work, so that no man can boast. So that's good news. But then the very next verse says, for we are God's workmanship, created by Christ Jesus for good work. So it's not about us not working. It's just, where is the source of our motivation, our strength, our energy?
And that's the message of Revelation 2. I've
Yeah.
seen your great works, but this I hold against you. Look at the heights from which you've fallen. You've forsaken your first love, the Holy Spirit.
That's right.
So yes, we're encouraged not just to be hearers of the word, but to be doers of the word. But let us not forget that the power and the anointing and the authority come through the infilling and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And when the Spirit says rest, we are commanded. You see, we call it the 10 Commandments.
That's right. That's right.
Not the 10 suggestions.
Yeah. And I think even to that idea, what's really important is we have these commandments, which truly are that. They're mandates that come from God. But I think one of the things that we are broken in our thinking about the commandments is that we look at the commandments as this prescriptive list of things that God is commanding us to do for the sake of restriction. But really, it's a commandment because God knows that these commandments are the primary pathway by which we can find communion with him. So rather than looking at it as, these are things that I need to do, no, it's, I get to because of the love of God. You know, one of the things that did change my life, you were asking the question, how does this change the way that you live? I felt like God was saying to me as I was wrestling through this, when you are unable to follow that commandment of rest, you are implicitly saying that I am unable to do my work without your help. You talk about a challenge. I mean, I felt like that was absolutely true. God was challenging me to see, why am I spinning my wheels? You know, there's a famous quote by Soren Kierkegaard, and he says, it is absolutely unethical when one becomes so busy communicating that he forgets to be what he teaches. I think about how often for us, many of us will talk about the idea of the need for rest in God, but yet in our vocational and our volunteerism ministry, we work. We're talking about this rest that we find in him, but we live contradictory. You know, there's another quote that says, how can I lead people beside the quiet, still waters if I'm in perpetual motion? You know, all of these ideas are game changers when we begin to adopt them in our lives.
Well, it's a fascinating read. It's an important study, and you also offer a 7-day to renewal devotional at curtiszackery.com. It's called Soul Rest, and you can just click on the 4th of July Soul Rest 7 Days to Renewal blog post, the latest one you have there, July 4th. Which will take you on a link to the devotional, and that is for free. And I've read through it, and I strongly suggest that you do it. I've found that in my 24/6 lifestyle that I've been able to accomplish more in 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, or living a 24/6 lifestyle. And people say, how do you do it? How do you get to the point where you're almost 67 years old? You do 3 hours of live TV a day. You teach 3 nights a week and every Sunday. How do you do it? Plus, you've written books. You've appeared in all kinds of other programs. How do you do it? And it's because God says, if I would just take the time to be rested and refreshed in him, and I will walk in all of his ways, then he will give me the desires of my heart, the ones he's implanted in me. You can find those secrets in this new book called Soul Rest, Reclaim Your Life, Return to Sabbath. Curtis Zackery, thank you so much for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you for having me.
God bless you, my friend.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.